Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. My co-presenters on this work are Biomedical and Erika Shimomoto, who work as machine learning and natural language processing at the National Institutes of Advanced Industrial Science and Technology in Japan. My name is Neil Miller. I'm a linguist at the University of Tsukuba, also in Japan. And our small group is looking at promotional language hype in research writing. And in this initial work, we're trying to automate some of the processes of identifying that. So let's start by talking about what we mean by hype. So we've defined it in general terms as hyperbolic and or subjective language that researchers use to glamorize, exaggerate, and promote aspects of their research. Examples we have here. So anything from crucial, important, critical, vital, novel, innovative, unprecedented, groundbreaking, original, pivotal, excellent. And you won't be surprised to hear that these terms have increased dramatically in the research. And a lot of our recent research has been looking at this type of language in the NIH ecosystem, specifically between 1985 and 2020. Our work has identified a lexicon of 139 hype adjectives that the researchers use to emphasize and promote the importance of their work, the novelty, the rigor, the scale, the utility of their findings, the qualities and characteristics of themselves as researchers and the research environment, their attitudes towards matters, and also the gravity of the problem being addressed. The plots at the bottom give some illustrations of the type of trends that are in grant applications. I don't know if you can see them, but novel, innovative, robust, scalable, and actionable. And these are for grant applications, but these trends are mirrored across the ecosystem, from funding opportunity announcements to subsequent publications in PubMed abstracts, indicating a trickle-down effect through the research environment, so a cascade. Does hype matter? Well, we'd argue that the way in which research is reported is actually pretty important. And some of the concerns are that hype will bias the evaluation of research, and also including that it can erode trust in science. There's some observational evidence to support this. So comparisons of successful and unsuccessful grant applications. So in the end, with NIH grant applications, the same 139 adjectives. Use of these is associated with success. And also from European funding agencies, the use of confident language, epistemic stance, is also associated with success. The trend is likely accelerated by the use of LLMs in text generation. So we're all seeing a lot more delving and showcasing going on these days. But we're interested in whether machine learning and LLMs can help reduce salesmanship and increase objectivity in reporting. So the final goal of this 4-year project that we've just started is to develop tools to detect and mitigate hype in biomedical texts and more broadly in scientific texts in general by giving feedback to users. The more moderate purpose of this study of this specific study here is this. So our prior linguistic work has been based on manual analysis, and it has identified the lexicon of 139 candidate terms. That's because it all depends on how they're actually used in the text. So with these 3 examples here, essential, in the first example, it's a technical term. There's no way it's promotional. The second one is probably promotional. The third one, we would argue, is not promotional, as grounds are given a justification for why it is essential. So our purpose in this study is to assess the feasibility of using formal guidelines for classifying text as hype, and then to apply annotated data to automate the hype detection process. This is an overview of what we did. So in the first step, we defined the annotation guidelines based on corpus analysis of NIH grant applications. And then we manually annotated 550 sentences from the same corpus to classify them as hype or not hype. We then conducted benchmarking experiments, formulating the task as a text classification, so hype or not hype. First of all, using traditional NLP classification methods, then using small pre-trained language models prompted with a general definition. So not actually our guidelines, but a general definition of hype, and also compared this to a human baseline prompted with the same general definition of hype. Our annotation guidelines, well, we created sequential guidelines for 11 adjectives promoting novelty from our lexicon. So creative, emerging, first, groundbreaking, innovative, latest, novel, revolutionary, unique, unparalleled, and unprecedented. They started off, it's a little bit small, don't know if you can see it. They started off by asking, does the adjective imply a positive value judgment? Yes or no? Then is it hyperbolic, i.e. exaggerated? Then after that, is it gratuitous, meaning it adds little to the meaning and can be deleted without changing the meaning or the structure of the sentence? And is, in addition, are grounds given, is justification given actually in the same sentence? Next, is it amplified? For example, it occurs with modifiers, highly robust, for example. And then also, finally, is it coordinated in the same noun phrase with other adjectives? So an innovative and novel study or tool. Each step was augmented with linguistic explanation and examples for the annotators. The annotators were us, the authors. So we had 119 disagreements, which tells you how difficult the task is. Meaning that our initial agreement was pretty low. We resolved these through discussion, and the final agreement after the discussion was 0.94, a minimum pairwise agreement there. So the final data set comprised 537 instant sentences, 392 which were classified as hype, and 143 as non-hype. We can see here on the right the classification of the sentences. So, not the sentences, of the adjectives. The sentences were split into an 80-20 training and testing data set. And we then, first of all, tested the traditional methods, which were multi-nominal naive Bayes, multivariate naive Bayes, latent semantic analysis, and support vector machines. We trained them on features, simple features, bag of words, and also word embeddings, so using global vector for word representations. And all of the traditional methods had similar performance. The support vector machines with word embeddings led to the best performance, but it's still behind the human baseline, which came in at an F1 score of 0.821. The methods based on bags of words were capable of performing reasonably well, but the language models seemed to perform better. We used relatively small language models, pre-trained language models, BERT, GPT-2, Llama, and GPT-4 Mini. So the pre-trained models performed poorly when frozen, so when they were only given the general definition of hype, not surprising, but they all performed better when they were fine-tuned, given the training data set to fine-tune them, with BERT outperforming all the methods, including the human baseline. One of the BERT, which had been trained on biomedical data, did not lead to any improvements in performance. So, some discussion points. The annotation guidelines led to good final agreement, but that hides the fact that the initial agreement was actually relatively low. This has been improved in subsequent iterations of the coding, indicating how actually fine-tuning for the annotators themselves is important. The traditional models led to moderate performance, fine-tuned, but surpassed human baseline. The task of annotating, well, subjectivity remains a challenge, and defining clear guidelines annotation guidelines that capture the linguistic variability of all the different adjectives is difficult. Another difficulty that adds to the subjectivity is the classification of the task as a binary labeling, so hype versus non-hype. It oversimplifies promotional language, we feel, and actually it exists more on a scale. So some of the terms are more promotional than others, and the disagreement is likely to occur at the lower ends of the scale. Limitations are that, well, many, but our data set is still very small and based on adjectives, and this limits the generalizability. So in conclusion, initial work, but we've annotated hype and detected it with reasonable reliability. With fine-tuned models being a promising tool. We, as next steps, in addition to actually improving on our guidelines and passing them directly to large language models, see how that works, we want to expand we have and are expanding the lexicon to include other promotional terms, so adverbs, verbs, nouns, etc., and also terms that modify and amplify or hedge the strength of claims. We're conducting experiments to scale the intensity of promotional terms, which we hope will be useful for moving away from a binary distinction. And also quantifying the cumulative effect of these terms within sentences, because that's only when often they become noticeable when you have a sentence containing multiple words, such as the ones we've been talking about. We're extending it to other types of texts that are less overtly promotional, because grant applications, their purpose is very often to promote. And in order to move this forward, we will be analyzing LLM's understanding of promotional language, because this is a task that can be lightly passed over to AI. That brings me to the end of my presentation, and these are the papers that I cited.
Very interesting presentation. Questions? Robbie.
Hi, Robert Thibault, Coalition for Learning Science. Thanks for the great presentation. I'm wondering the impact of hype. Do you have any idea for the reader what the hype actually does to how they interpret it? Because I could imagine some people would then trust it less, some people might trust it more, but the drive to make sure there's no hype.
Yeah.
Okay, do we know what impact that might have?
That's a very good question. So my own personal feeling is that it can, if done in extremes, it can alienate the reader. So my interest in this comes as an educator who actually, as part of his day job, helps colleagues and students write papers. And it can alienate the reader if done too much. So it puts up the defenses. There's in terms of evidence, there's the observational evidence that I talked about, so comparisons of successful versus unsuccessful grants. However, we've been more direct, so causal link is still, there's still not much evidence, but we've been conducting an experimental study where we've given students abstracts that have been altered with containing hype and not containing hype, and we've been getting them to rate them. At the moment, we're still halfway through the data collection, and there's no difference. So my feeling, though, is, however, that it does make a difference. And yeah.
Yeah, great.
Okay.
Yes, please.
Yeah, hi, thank you. Thank you for your talk. It was really good. Doreen Valentine with ISMAP, the International Society of Medical Publication Professionals. So, I think, I've been an author and a medical writer and played many roles. And one thing in the scientific literature, the medical literature, it by design never uses like an active voice in the sense of verb tense. Everything is caveated with this may and may potentially. And, so I just wondered, you were conscious about context to how these potentially hype terms would be used, but there's other context, like if an author were to say, this is a potentially first in class to the best of our knowledge. So there's sometimes a lot of like language around that tries to soften it. And I just wondered if you looked at that sort of more narrative context.
So your question is how terms like potentially have changed?
Yeah, or how they're a tool to sort of, mitigate or assuage the degree of hype or promotionality.
Okay. So terms, okay, I get it. Sorry. So yeah, we've done studies so related to the studies of the NIH ecosystem, which was looking at hype. We've also done studies in linguistics journals looking at what's called epistemic stance, which is how the certainty and strength of claims are altered. And there's increasing certainty over the same data set over the same period. Although terms like potentially do increase, potentially is also, but at the same time, terms that are weaker have decreased. So yeah. So there's highly, reveal, demonstrate, all these verbs that express a strong certainty have increased over time.
Yeah,
And
thank you.
Not just in grant applications, but also in subsequent publications.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing up the linguistics. And just because I have this audience here, when you mentioned the word delve, that's been my favorite word for like 20 years. So,
Okay.
and the M dash. So I'm sorry that like AI is becoming a red flag for itself with some of my favorite, ways of writing.
Well, it's good to hear that people actually do use it.
On microphone, please.
Nihar Shah from Carnegie Mellon University. So this analysis was on public-facing abstracts of funded NIH grants, right?
Yes.
Yes. So, okay, so let me play an Uno reverse card and say that given the current situation in the US, maybe it will be nice for people to know that the research that we are doing is really new and novel and innovative and incredible.
It would be nice for them to know that.
I'm saying that like for these abstracts of funded grants, like the current pitch is that it's a bad thing for you for using these words. But I'm playing a Uno reverse cards and saying that, well, maybe, it's a good thing for people to know that the research is incredible and novel and innovative.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a good point because we do need novel science and, motivated, researchers and all that. But the problem is, I guess, when, so in NIH grant applications, I think from 1985, 4% of abstracts contained the term novel. It's now up to 36%. Of all abstracts, which then begs the term, well, what actually is novel? Which comes back to the point that probably, well, language actually changes over time, and the word's probably been losing its meaning, which is an established process of language change. That's something called semantic bleaching, where terms tend to be used in a more exaggerated meaning until that bleaches out the original meaning, and then it becomes, and then new terms have to come in. So novel is probably is no longer actually sufficient. You now need to describe as groundbreaking or unprecedented or revolutionary.
Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, right?
Sorry?
Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious.
Exactly, exactly. So I'm not necessarily saying it's a bad thing. And that's why we want to actually move away from the term hype and promotionality so we can quantify it on a grade and give people feedback on how objective the writing is, which is an ultimate goal. And we're not there yet, but that's what we're working towards.
So novel is not novel. And one last question.
Thanks. Matt Goldrick, Northwestern. And as a fellow linguist, I'm really glad you're bringing this perspective to this discussion. This has really been really fantastic discussion. I was wondering about if some of these are being developed in consultation with the people who complain about hype in the biomedical research community. So I'm wondering if the senses of hype that editors are complaining about or consumers of information are complaining about, is this targeting that? This does seem like hype to me, but I was wondering if it's solving is it solving a problem for advanced consumers? All of us kind of automatically discount this information, or is it about communicating to the general public and saying, look, if we want to communicate to the general public and be honest, does it make sense? I'm wondering about the audience to which this particular type of hype behavior is addressing the issue.
Okay, so in terms of feedback that we've had on our analyses, so the feedback from editors of medical journals have said that this is something that they've noticed.
Okay.
And this is something that if something is groundbreaking or revolutionary or unprecedented, then that's something that probably others should say about the research rather than the researchers themselves. In terms of the other stakeholders, we've done ethnographic work with authors, asking them why they use the terms, and they've confirmed that usually it is, this sounds better, this sounds more convincing. So it is promotional, and it's not surprising that it's promotional because people want to put their best foot forward. But yeah, as I said, I think it can alienate readers, and it's not necessarily always in their best interests.
Thank you so much. That's great.